This is the last episode in this current run of the RJM Classic Motorcycles podcast. I can't believe it's taken 11 episodes to get round to a discussion about this, but as you can see from the title, today we're talking about the process of dismantling a motorcycle. We'll also finish off with a quick tip. What's it about? Wait and see, or just, skip to the end. But don't do that, enjoy the rest of the show first. I should also start by saying that early on I gesture a book at the camera. For those of you not watching on YouTube, the book is called Motorcycle Moonshine by Jack Gorn, and it will probably be the main focus of its own episode one day, because not only is it very hard to track down, it's also very entertaining, as Ray will prove right now.
Engines can either be taken or shaken to bits. The former is called taking down, and the latter picking it up. If you take it down, you'll be amazed at the number of bits that occur. If you pick it up, you'll be even more amazed at the acreage over which the bits are scattered and the size of the bill which follows. Even when you take it down voluntarily, you'll say, "Heavens, I'll never get it back." Hours of oily labour will prove you right. As you can't leave the bits all over the backyard, the next step is to get a sack, shove the bits inside and take it to a garage man who will say, "Too busy, mate." Whereupon you grab a conrod and tap him smartly on the hair oil. This produces a sound called doink and some red stuff called blood and a garage man that no longer says "too busy, mate." Await his recovery, and with the conrod conspicuously at the rodial slope, the job will be done in a couple of thou ticks or a trice, whichever is the cheaper.
Now why, you may be asking, did we just read that, and what is it from? About which more, perhaps, on another occasion, apart from that is it. Sorry, should be gentle with it. We've only got one and it was published in 1951, but there we go. The topic of this episode is dismantling, as you possibly guessed by the title. The intention is to give advice to someone who has recently acquired a motorcycle with the intention of restoring it themselves. And this should hopefully ensure that you get off on the right foot. Now, in conducting some initial research for this episode, we were reminded of something that star of previous episode Jack mentioned to you, were we not?
What is it about guys and motorcycles?
Which means?
Well, for some mystical reason, known only to men, whilst they would never willingly tear down and try to rebuild a motor car necessarily, or engage in advanced plumbing, they seem to be quite happy to tear motorcycles apart. And Jack's theory is that on a motorcycle, you can see everything. So how difficult can it be?
And we should say at this stage, we're absolutely not looking down on anybody keen to get stuck in and have a go at things, because really we wish more people would do that, because then more people would have an appreciation for what's involved. But if you've got no experience of stripping something apart, that's the easy bit. But if it's not done in a careful and considered manner, there's all manner of difficulties that can arise. And you, over the years, Ray, have seen a number of situations in which that is the case. I'm reminded of a Norton Commando that came to us in a partially stripped state with some damage to the fins on the barrel. Yeah,
urgent telephone call, I think, one Saturday morning. Somebody was obviously in a deep state of frustration, trying to attend to his Norton Commando, and the phone message I got was that he was having enormous difficulty getting the barrel off the crankcase mouth, and he'd actually damaged one or two cooling fins, and could I help? My response being, yeah, bring it in. I'll, point you in the right direction, or remove it if you're unable to. So he came through the door, struggling through the door with this bottom end of a Norton Commando engine that he was carrying, and dropped it down just inside our workshop, and had, as it turns out, knocked every fucking cooling fin off that entire barrel. Absolutely every last one. My reaction was to lean smartly forward, peel back the head gasket that he hadn't removed, to reveal the 4 bolts. Obviously, it was an 850, and he wasn't expecting those bolts to be here.
Are you going to say what he said, though? I can beep it out.
He looked at me, he looked at the barrel, he looked at the head gasket and said, I've been a bit of a c***, haven't I? See, I didn't want to do it.
No, no, no.
You
no.
made me.
I know. I suppose that brings us nicely on to the first maxim or piece of advice, which is know what you're looking for. A strip down is not the time to be finding out what it all looks like and how it all works. You must have a clear view of that before you go in, right?
Yeah, and we had an anecdotal example of this. There was a young gentleman who'd acquired himself a late 60s TR6. It was a strange machine because actually somebody tried to make it cosmetically look like a lot like a T140, and why somebody would want to make a more valuable bike look like a less valuable one. And as we did various jobs on this for him, I was constantly having to remind myself, no, it's a 650, it's not a 750. It was obviously a relatively young person who is relatively inexperienced in the classic bike culture that had acquired this machine, and he was a bit of a sensitive soul as well. And my admonishing him for various things in a polite and friendly way didn't exactly help. Like when he managed to decimate his electrical system by putting heated grips on this. It took some explaining that really they were never designed to go on a machine like that, and your charging system wasn't really good enough to be able to deal with that. And over time, I think he'd had a few adverse comments, again relating to the fact that it was a quite a sought-after bike, remodelled to look like a somewhat cheaper machine. I think he got a bit touchy about it in the finish, and he turned to me when we were having this conversation, because I in the finish realised that whoever had restored this bike actually hadn't had a lot of the original bike left, and had obviously, built something up to suit him. But we were. The owner and I were discussing this point, and he was saying that one or two adverse remarks had been made at shows regarding it. And he turned to me all straight face and says, "The word sodomised has been used." But on a later occasion, he was quizzing me closely. This is after he was back in the saddle and got the bike back, quizzing me about what was inside the timing cover, and. With reference to the conversation we were having at the time, I said, you don't need to worry about that. There's nothing in there that you need to concern yourself with at this time. And he finally fessed up that he'd taken all the screws out, got it half on, half off, damaged the gasket, so really needed now to know how to take it fully off. And this enabled me to make the point that, you don't want to be removing covers as a matter of exploration. You need to know what's inside and what the issues are before you ever get the toolkit out. And obviously the first way of arriving at some certainty in that regard is any bike you're looking to dismantle or restore or whatever, or just plain service or repair, you need a workshop manual, and I don't mean Haynes manual, and you need a parts list for that particular model.
Yes, as you say, Ray, there's really no substitute for having the right literature. Because understanding if you're looking at the engine there and you want to learn and you want to get stuck in, how else can you do it apart from looking at the proper literature and knowing what you expect to find? And that's good as well, because if you know what you're expecting to find, you know when you've found something that deviates from that. Obviously, if you're stripping apart a motor that's 50, 60 years old, around that, it's lived a few lives before it's got to you, and we see often things where someone has had a motor apart and back together, and the mistakes that were made the first time have been made again the second and third time. So,
yeah, that's absolutely right. You end up with a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, and each time somebody without the right data strips something apart and puts it back together using all the old faults and all the old cock-ups that were present before, so the thing just gets further and further away from where it should be, and also less and less reliable, and will go a shorter and shorter distance between breakdowns.
We do have a good weapon in our arsenal these days in terms of stripping things apart, that most of us have got the facilities to take photographs of things, and we take lots of photographs, particularly if the client has come a fair distance to get to us. We've got, at the moment, a machine undergo full restoration that came to us from Guernsey. And we like it if people are local. They can come in and have a look and see what we've been doing, because there's no real substitute for that. But by taking lots of pictures and emailing customers, we can keep everybody fully appraised. And I think that's exactly what someone should be doing if they're undertaking a project themselves, because it's far too easy to go, oh, well, that's a bit interesting. Okay, well, I'll remember that. But,
no, you won't.
You don't always do it. 6 months later, you won't necessarily remember it.
Only 6 months.
Well,
no, I mean, to be fair, let me nail my colours to the mast. I'm perfectly in favour of people having a go themselves. I do worry that the level of background knowledge of folk attempting these things now is diminishing as this whole sort of genre fades away from regular culture. I mean, I'm a lad from a regular sort of 60s or 70s council estate where there was a block of garages where on any given Saturday afternoon there could have been 8 or 10 blokes all working on their own motors and they're on their own motorcycles. And what that did mean that there was a support structure. That support structure doesn't exist if you're working at home now. And the other thing is, obviously, with reference to mistakes in the past, there are certain things that you physically may not be able to do at home yourself. For example, if you get down to the crankshaft and want to, as you should, remove the sludge trap, tube and plug, very often you're not going to do it without use of oxyacetylene. And similarly, where in the past people have used Loctite in all the wrong places, and if you're ever tempted to use Loctite, have a look in the book. It was available then. The factory did recommend it in certain applications, but if they haven't recommended it, don't bloody well use it.
Yeah, I think just to sum up that point in a pithy and concise manner, know your limitations and the limitations of your equipment.
I was going to say, the point is, of course, that one of the reasons why we operate as we do, and for those who want to do their own restoration fundamentally, but are obviously struggling with certain things, we've always said, particularly for the more budget conscious, we're perfectly happy just to do the scary bits.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Something that I've personally found has been very helpful as I've learnt to do this stuff over the years is if you're stripping something apart and something is stuck in place or seized due to galvanic corrosion or anything of that nature, if something is not coming apart as it should do and you find yourself in a situation where you've got to risk damaging something, know what bit to sacrifice.
Yeah. One of the benefits we obviously have is that we're acquiring parts for quite a narrow range of vehicles on a regular basis. We know what's available and what isn't, and we know from what is available whether it's good stuff or not, so that if the situation arises where something has to be destroyed or damaged to preserve the integrity of other neighbouring parts, then you know precisely what to sacrifice.
Yeah, it sounds a bit scary when you're talking about sacrificing and damaging things, and really that's an absolute last worst case scenario, and that doesn't really come up often. And another thing that's important to know to do is to gradually increase the, for lack of a better word, brutality with which you're going at something. Say even just a primary cover screw that's stuck in place.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think sometimes, because of the limitations of tools and equipment you may have available to you, the escalation is not radical enough soon enough, because you will tend to explore the limit of the equipment you've got. Very often damage can be done. And, at the end of the day, we take enough phone calls as it is. I'm quite happy to take a few more. If you're stuck, just ring somebody and ask for some advice rather than just, persevering at home, because actually, very often no good comes of it.
Yeah, and there's really talking about knowing the limitations of yourself and your tools, there's no real substitute for having a complete arsenal of tools at your disposal. I mean, I remember times from in the dim distant past many years ago where I'm trying to remove something and I'm having a bit of difficulty. and you go and get what is seemingly a very similar screwdriver, for example, yet that just makes all the difference.
Old age and treachery.
It is.
Yeah, and there is also the point, and one of the benefits that you've had particularly, Rowan, is that you've never had to struggle without the right tool, because obviously there was a complete infrastructure more or less in place before you ever arrived professionally on the scene. Now, very often what we see is people trying to either dismantle or reassemble machines without some fairly vital special equipment. So, potentially you're undertaking these tasks without the experience and without the proper equipment to do it. And again, it can be done, and it's all very commendable, but very often that piece of special equipment is not that expensive.
I think really one just has to be careful to be patient with something. I mean, it's all too easy to impose deadlines on oneself, and that's all the more amplified when you're doing it professionally. But there can come a situation, particularly if you are limited in equipment or what have you, that the sensible thing to do is actually go away and think about it.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in that. Again, fortunately, as we for all the years we have been as busy as we are, there's never any incentive to keep struggling on with one particular job that's merrily heading south. We've got the opportunity to roll that one off the bench, roll the next one back on the bench, and get to work with that. And, very often while you're conducting a routine task on job number 2, you're still thinking in the background about job number 1, and it's very unusual if by the end of the day you haven't got some new ideas.
I suppose that's actually an advantage we have over someone doing it themselves from home, because we don't have just that one bike fixated in our mind. Indeed. Of, oh God, I really want to get this done. Really, we have the luxury of going, well, look, I can get engrossed in something else, and possibly something you do on that one job may end up being relevant to the previous job, and it can all work together harmoniously. Another situation that is all too common, let's assume you've got the motor stripped apart, or the complete chassis as well, and you're looking at it strewn about the place, and suddenly it's taking up a whole lot more space on your garage floor than it did when it was all in the crankcases and what have you. The best way around that is to come to a good storage system. Obviously, we've, over many years, and I guess you never stop developing it, we've honed a great storage system. Talk about what we do.
Well, we in relatively recent times hit upon really useful boxes. Now, this is a brand name. I think they're possibly made up in Yorkshire. It is an absolutely superb storage system that has allowed us to, obviously we have an area of our premises where the dismantled product of various customers' machines are stored, and using really useful boxes in a sensible way has enabled us to, if not triple, certainly double our storage space, and also keep absolute segregation of bits from various different people's machines. I mean, to be fair, if you've got a G3 matchless in a box next to bits with T140, then you're not going to mistake those. But when you've got, as we have at the moment, 4 or 5 A65 motors being rebuilt, we've got 4 Norton Commandos in bits, and probably half a dozen Triumph Twins, you do need to make clinically certain that everything is staying well away from other people's bits.
Yeah, and something else that we do on top of the really useful storage boxes is with a great big permanent marker, literally write the customer's name on each surface of the box. That way, wherever it is in the storage facility, you can look at it, see that person's name, and see what it is. That's vastly preferable, I think, to what we have seen in the past, things like cylinder heads or whatnot, which have had a job number stamped into them by whoever's worked on them.
Oh yeah, I mean that again is the height of brutality in my view, where you're actually using a number stamp to bash a 4 or a 5 digit number on the various components of somebody's engine. I mean, think of the damage you could potentially do. and two, think of the amount of time it takes. If you've got a dedicated box or a dedicated series of boxes, all with lids that go on and seal properly, you know that you're going to get no contamination and no migration of one job to another. And also if your storage conditions and your working conditions are less than ideal, they're not going to get attacked by the damp and dust and so forth.
Yeah, breaking that down on a slightly more micro scale, in recent years we've been using ziplock bags to put smaller items in, and that's been really helpful as well. I'm also a big fan of lock wiring or cable tying things together that are supposed to live together. Or good thing with a Ziploc bag is it's got a little window on it that you can write something on it with a Sharpie permanent marker we use as well. They're good for that. Literally just a case of keep all your stuff for the timing side together, all the stuff for the primary side together, etc., etc. And that's massively going to pay dividends. And that's something I felt early on in doing this I had to kind of teach myself to do, because obviously I always had you there, Ray, as a backstop. But over the years you've done this, you don't need to quite so meticulously label and bag up everything, because...
Well, no, I mean, that's fair, but not only, if somebody bought, a stripped-down A65 motor into me that was all in these nice little seal bags, very often I just used to take them all out of the bags to start with so I could actually see the bits. Now, yeah, okay, with certain models, I'm in no doubt as to what the address and telephone number of the name, address, and telephone number of a given part is. That said, with the amount of activity we've now got on the go, I think I would tend to err more along the lines of what you do than what I used to do.
Well, I feel I've, in recent years, been able to ease off on it, but just thinking back to what helped me early on, and I think given that I've, been on a pretty heavy crash course over the past 5 or 6 years or whatever I've been doing this, it's still easy enough for me to think back to what do I wish I'd told myself now at the time, which of course must have been a bit difficult for you, because of course when I was brought on board, you've been doing this for a long time still, so you had to, and I think you did on the whole a very good job of it, had to put yourself in the mindset of somebody who's actually never done this before.
And moreover, never fully expected to ever really have to train somebody to do what I'd done for 30 odd years. And also, there was a bit of a language barrier because I'd never had to articulate any of it. So physically trying to explain some of the nuances of what we do. So, I mean, the bottom line is that, if you're really got your heart set on, dismantling and restoring largely at home a machine, you need to understand that there's so much more to it. But there is help there available.
And I think as you go through and strip things apart, you'll find your own methods of, you'll know yourself what's going to help you remember something. Something which I do, which I haven't seen anybody else do, is when it comes to timing cover, outer screws, primary cover screws, etc., etc. I've seen a lot of people, they'll get a bit of cardboard and draw the shape of the cover on it and poke the screws through. I'm bad at drawing, so I've never felt that doing so would be in any way beneficial. But by starting at the 9 o'clock position, or vaguely, it varies, at a 9 o'clock position, as you remove the screws, of course you should loosen everything off and remove them gradually, but as you remove them, wipe them over with something like, we use Silcoline contact cleaner to degrease them, and then with a Sharpie permanent marker. Nobody's paying us to say this. If only. I have to get in contact with Sharpie. Right in, I use Roman numerals just because it's easier, the order of them, and something like that, and you bag them up nicely as well. It's going to make it so much easier than looking at all these screws of different lengths and going, well, now hang on, what's going there? Because if you're well into reassembly and you can be a bit ham-fisted with a screw on the background of a thread not being possibly all that good, although one should really deal with that, you should be aware of that once you've stripped apart and you're inspecting, it can be game over right there largely, can't it?
Yeah, just as a word of warning for those, who are embarking upon this this kind of behaviour. I had a visit from somebody some years ago who had rebuilt his own. I think it was probably, yes, it would have been a fairly late T140, and he was having, as so many people do, difficulties sealing the pushrod tubes, and clearly had the head off and back on this bike a number of times and was still struggling badly. So we, had a conversation. I went through the menu. Now, you have done this, haven't you? Yes, I've done that. But you haven't done that, have you? No, I didn't do that. And so on and so forth. And I said, well, to be perfectly honest, if what you're saying to me is absolutely true, there is absolutely no reason why you should still have a problem. And the conversation went on to other things and so on and so forth. And just as he was about to leave the premises, he sort of reached in his trouser pocket and jangled around and pulled out 2 items. He said, by the way, he said, any idea what these are? Well, those were the bottom pushrod tube steel support rings. So, small wonder, really. In the same week, I had another individual coming to me, having phoned first and having described what I presume to have been a partial seizure, again on the Triumph Twin. And so I said, well, bring the barrel and pistons in, because he got it dismantled by this stage. I said, and I'll have a look to see whether I can give you some advice to prevent a reoccurrence. And he dutifully brought the things in and popped it on my counter, and I had a look at the condition of the bore and the condition of the pistons and rings, and confirmed that he'd assembled it himself. And I said, well, if you want my honest opinion, it looks like the rings have never been gapped. And he looked at me with a strange look on his face, and he said, in what sense?
But I mean, and it's difficult for us to report an anecdote like that and not come across as patronising. But
Don't mean to.
No, but because if you don't know, then you don't know. And a lot of the times, particularly with workshop manuals, particularly that are contemporaneous with the machines, the language in which they are written at times can differ greatly from how we speak these days.
The only thing in their favour, though, I would jump in and say that unlike just about any handbook, manual or operator's manual you find these days, where there's whole sections of the bike that are considered to be too complex for you to look at, you will never find that in a old British motorcycle manual. The only one of the nuances is that, and people will worry themselves to death over certain features that we know from experience to be completely irrelevant, and gloss over other areas which we know to be absolutely critical, the importance of which are not necessarily stressed in the book. So again, it's where you need a bit of support and advice.
And of course, there are situations in which workshop manuals where things are not necessarily correct. We've talked about on B25s with dual stamp timing wheels before, where the book is not necessarily correct on that.
And the other reason why I said at the top of the show that you need to avoid the Haynes manuals particularly is because, say for example, if you were to ever try and rebuild an A65 motor using the instructions contained within the Haynes manual, it'll last about 500 miles before it goes bang.
You were talking a minute ago there about how on modern motorcycles you'll see bits in workshop manuals saying, this isn't for you to look at. An advantage of the motorcycles and the era that we're particularly involved in is things were built to be reassembled, just looking in terms of the durability of some of the components when compared with sort of 70s and 80s and probably even today. Japanese machines, for example, it's a good example of why you should learn some stuff and get stuck in, because at the end of the day they are built to be inspected and reassembled.
Well, and to be fair, with the sort of mileage that they were capable of between engine rebuilds, it's as well. The more modern product and foreign motorcycles do tend to be, in a sense, sealed for life. While you can dismantle them and repair them there's a greater magnitude of difficulty because they really weren't intended to be routinely dismantled and overhauled, whereas obviously the older British motorcycles were designed with that very intention. I mean, for example, with the Triumph twins that the police used, and particularly the Met Police, you would expect during the service life of that vehicle for an engine to be rebuilt. Whereas with modern machines in modern commercial service, you wouldn't. Very often when police garages were issued new bikes, they also got issued some stock engines as well, which is why, with particular reference to ex-police bikes, you very seldom find matching frame and engine numbers unless the bike has been in the service of some sleepy county constabulary somewhere where they wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and thinking on a global scale and looking back over time, when it comes to anything mechanical or technological, these things are always first purchased and dealt with by enthusiasts before things go mainstream. I mean, we see now occasionally, we've joked before, bumper stickers on cars saying powered by fairy dust. Anybody who was going to purchase a motorcycle or a car in the 1920s or 30s wouldn't have taken that attitude and would have wanted to have been the expert on it. So
and back in the 50s and 60s, and to some extent the 70s, because of course, and particularly on that council estate I was talking about that I grew up on, nobody could afford professional intervention. You could barely afford the bloody car or the bike in the first place, and very often, as in my case, it actually pieced your first transport together out of disparate bits that came from all sorts of people to make up a motorcycle in the first place. So it wasn't. It was never, for me originally, it was never the hobby. It was just a practical way of having transport I could afford.
Yeah. So I suppose what I'm really saying is if you do choose to try and restore a machine yourself or get involved to some extent, don't feel too much like you're treading on sacred ground, because to become an expert in something you're owning and riding and really at the end of the day putting your life in the hands of, it's only right that you should try and become an expert on it.
And it's actually very empowering in the sense that if you have, albeit with a little help from your friends or whomsoever, managed to restore a machine to working condition, and looking smart, it's so empowering as you use it on the roads to know that actually you've seen every part of the inside of that bike and its engine, and that if something is about to go wrong or something does go wrong, you've got a good chance of dealing with it yourself. Whereas an awful lot of people who buy a machine in a fit of rose-tinted retrovision, I feel sure, after one or two breakdowns, are riding around in fear and trepidation of the next thing that's going to go wrong and who the hell they're going to find to fix it.
Yeah. Let's finish off with one more anecdote I had in my notes here when we discussed this a week ago, something to do with a T160 that came in that was subject to a number of oil leaks.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I had a gentleman contact me, this is a good number of years ago now, who'd got a T160 that, as he described it, had to have the engine rebuilt, and it had been leaking copious amounts of oil ever since. So I said, fine, bring it in, I'll have a look at it. And he actually rode it to us some distance, and I had an initial look as it sat outside on our forecourt dripping lubricant, and I said to the owner, I don't think it's your engine that's leaking, I think it's your gearbox that's leaking. He said, oh Christ, is that why the gear change has been tightening up for the last 10 miles? So he said, well, what are we going to do? So I said, well, first things first. I said, first opportunity I get, I'll replenish the oil in the gearbox and take it on a road test and see whether you've done any damage. And at that point, I can also confirm where the oil's leaking from. Well, sure enough, I went out on road test with it and stopped in a lay-by just before I turned for home to check where the oil was now freshly leaking from. And sure enough, it was the gearbox. And so I accelerated away from this lay-by in first gear, went for second gear, no second gear. In fact, not much at all other than first gear. So we limped back. But that turned out overall to be a whole collection of events. One, I couldn't understand why a relatively low mileage, fully dressed T160 had to have an engine rebuild. I mean, at the end of the day, they're a pretty robust motor. But what I discovered was at some point, and I was fascinated also by the fact that there were fibre washers underneath the heads of the screws that were the points inspection cover. And it transpired that at some point in the past, some lunatic had decided that because oil was piddling out of there, that it was probably wet sumping. And because of that, they then added an anti-drain down valve, one of these that's integral with the oil tank filter, in the hope of stopping that. Well, straight away, and remembering that T160s have got a perfectly good anti-drain down valve actually in the engine casings arranged adjacent to the pump, which is exactly where you want it. So as a consequence, every time you did an oil change on this machine, not knowing there were two anti-drain down valves, you potentially starve the engine of oil because, of course, straight away you've got about an 18-inch length of hose, which has got no oil in it whatsoever, that the pump is trying to pull past this airlock to actually get some lubricant and, cool itself down a bit. So that was why it needed the engine rebuild. And it was then when we finally got it all bolted back together, all the repairs done, was the damn thing then wouldn't start. And you think Twilight Zone. And it transpired that where all this hot oil had been getting into where the points used to live, and it was a now electronic ignition, and this was, a triple, so there were three magnets on this plate. One of them, more often than the others, had been brought to a standstill when the bike had been stopped with the magnet in the hot oil. Now, over time, of course, that had decreased the magnetism of that particular magnet. And what I didn't know at the time until we spoke to Boyer Branson is that you needed only one magnet to pass one coil on the stator plate to turn the box on, which is what I was sensing and what I was getting. But you actually need two magnets passing two coils to actually initiate a spark. So in other words, there weren't enough magnets still working to actually get the thing to make sparks and run. And that was some real digging to get to the bottom of.
Well, there you go. I hope that was helpful. Here's our final quick tip of the series. So for this week's piece of advice, we are talking valve grinding. Ray, why don't you start off by telling us the traditional method for lapping valves in and the tool involved?
Well, in the old days, you got this piece of wooden dowling with a rubber sucker on each end. And you sat there reciprocating your hands forward and backwards around the stick.
And for those watching on YouTube, this is what it looks like if you haven't seen one before. Now, what are the shortcomings of this arrangement?
Well, to start with, it's the actual act of doing it is one of complete futility, insofar as you could be there until hell freezes over. And into the mythology was woven the fact that this reciprocal motion was a vital part of the process. Now, I can tell everybody for an absolute certainty that is not so. But the narrative was further propagated insofar as there was manufactured at one point a device that would go into a drill and that would replicate that reciprocating motion. You could have saved yourself the money. My personal method is a lot faster.
And what is that? Before I gesture it up to the camera.
Well, again, it's using the rubber sucker, but just literally mounted on a grinding stone that normally fits into a conventional drill. You just put the rubber sucker on the end of that, and away you go at a much higher speed. Yeah,
now that's all well and good, but when you taught me how to use this method, I didn't get on at all well with it.
You didn't?
I don't know what it is. In my experience, whenever I'm using it, the sucker just slips off and I can't seem to get it to stay in place. I don't know why, but I thought, well, what if I came at it from the other direction? I figured if I turn the head over, then I can make up a tool that's going to clamp on the bottom of the valve stem, and then there's no way that's going to fall off. So I think it just goes to show that there is one narrative, there's your alternative, and then there's what I found works for me.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's important advice to consider, not just on the micro scale of these are the tools we use, but also when it comes to taking advice, take what's useful to you and expand upon it.
Yeah, I mean, the real takeaway from this is that you don't need that reciprocating motion. It plays no part. It safeguards nothing. I've been doing it with a purely rotary motion with a drill for over 30 years, and it's never been an issue.
Yeah, and as much as I'm a fan of my tool, I say tool, when I was helping out a friend of mine with some stuff on his CG125, I found that all of these silly little tools we'd made up over the years were too big for the components. So I actually had to make up a much smaller one for the purpose, which I've never used since and might as well give to him, but there we go. Well, that's all from us this week. If you like that, you can subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also visit our website, rjmclassic.com, or email me specifically about the podcast at rjmpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.